Well, it is wonderful to be here, and especially wonderful to be here in this space of BookBug, because you are so lucky to be in a community that has an independent bookstore that... And just as we celebrate independent media on our book tours in our books, we celebrate independent bookstores, because these are truly sanctuaries in our community, sanctuaries of free thinking, sanctuaries of dissent, and you can just feel it in here, that what you have is special, and we have to preserve these places, support these places to ensure that we always have spaces where independent thought, independent news, independent media is not just for available, but treasured. So thank you, Joanna. And Amy had a lot of projects at that point. She was the news director at WBAI in New York, one of the 5 flagship Pacific radio stations. But this was going to be different. Instead of Wake Up Call, which is what she was hosting every morning, live, the news from around the city and around the country and the world, it was going to be an election show. And the election show was going to run for 8 months. It would run from February to November of 1996. That was the re-election campaign of Bill Clinton, who was running against a guy named Bob Dole, for those of you who remember. And it was all going to go away about a week after the election. And she told her family, very excitedly, this new show was going to be called Democracy Now! To which I responded, because, as her brother, I had to give her the unvarnished truth. Democracy Now? That's what you're going to call your radio show? I mean, nobody's going to listen to that. That sounds like an intramural organization. You have to just fly under the radar, call it, coffee hour with Amy, and then tune it in and you knock them right between the eyes. But so I assured her that it was a great experiment, but it had no future. So fortunately, we discovered then what all of you have discovered. Amy has a knack for defying conventional wisdom. So ignoring my advice, she forged ahead, and of course, Democracy Now! Did not end as an 8-month experiment, because the demand for it was greater after the election than it was even before the election. And that's because this was a whole new idea. The idea to cover news not from the corporate suites and the perspective of the powerful, but from the streets, from your perspective. Suddenly, the election was a vehicle to go around the country and lift up the movements that were in every community, the change makers, the peacemakers, the people sitting around their kitchen tables thinking hard and acting about how to make the world better. Standing up to the powerful, not representing their interests from the TV screens to their, their extracurricular activities. And so it really was, we have for the longevity of Democracy Now! A little bit to thank the corporate media itself, which has left a vacuum here. We know this from the Iraq War, when instead of challenging those in power, instead of challenging the myths and the lies that were coming out of the Bush administration about non-existent weapons of mass destruction, we had our entire corporate media establishment acting as a conveyor belt for the lies, a megaphone for the powerful. Well, along comes 2015, and we have what in many other settings might be a cartoon character of a candidate, a reality TV star, a billionaire, going around saying that he was really looking out for the little guy. Donald Trump understood something. He understood our media and how it works better than our media understood. He understood that if he could have this toxic brew of misogyny, xenophobia, lies, and theatrics calling people names. He would be irresistible to what we call, what passes for a media. The amount of free media that he was given in the primary through general election season, take a guess at what that free media was worth. $1 billion, somebody said. Okay, you're lowballing it. $5 billion is what has been put as the price of what that was worth. Mind you, this is $5 billion that other candidates would have to raise. No, for him, it came served on a silver platter. He got more free media than Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Cruz, Rubio, and Paul Ryan combined. So that's how it worked, and now we see the results. And as we saw the results in Iraq, the lies cost lives. The media has a responsibility. You know, in journalism, courage isn't something that can happen in hindsight. Speaking truth to power is most important and when it matters. It's not a comfortable place to be, and in our book, there's a whole section on an independent reporter's rap sheet. What has happened to Amy all these years as she's been out there speaking truth to power? Surviving a massacre in East Timor. The number of times she's been arrested, harassed, detained, and assaulted by police in her efforts to simply cover the news. And she'll say more about that in her remarks. So democracy now has been the beating heart of a movement that spans the globe, that connects people instead of divides people, that lets you know every day you tune in that you are not crazy and you are not alone. 20 years after I told her that this show with this crazy name was never going to live, I am so thrilled to say that here is to another 20, 40, or 60 years with the most courageous, tenacious, and dedicated journalist in America, my sister Amy.
We are doing an independent media tour throughout the country to talk about the importance of these sacred independent spaces, like right here at BookBug. I really do see, and it's so wonderful to be here for the first time, to be in a space that loves books and education. I want to thank Joanna and Derek and Jessica and all the folks that make BookBug your living room. You know, in my house and our house, when we were growing up, the bookshelves were the wallpaper of every room. Our walls were lined with books. My family's idea of a nice Saturday would be to take the train into New York City, and we'd go to the first Barnes & Noble when it was only one store, and we'd spend the day there. When my parents were selling their house in Bayshore, Long Island, where we grew up, Brightwaters, to move to another community, we had to sell some of the stuff in our house. So it was an open house, and we were selling the books. I mean, that was basically it, all over our house. And I couldn't find my father in the midst of our sale. And I'm looking everywhere for him, and then I see him. His face is to the wall. He's in a wheelchair in the living room. I run over and said, "Dad, what are you doing?" His back is to everyone. And I come to look at him, and his lap is filled with books. I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" He said, "I promise I'll buy them." He just couldn't let go of the books. And one day I was having dinner with them in the city. I live in New York City, in the Village. And we came out, and their car was stolen. So we looked everywhere, couldn't find, it wouldn't just like go down the street. And we go to the police station. Did they impound it? But no one could help us. So we took a cab to look at all the impoundment lots along the Hudson River. My dad wasn't saying much. My mother wasn't either. And then I decide, okay, I've got to get them home. So they'll take the Long Island Railroad home. And we bring them to Long Island Railroad Station. All of a sudden, my father says, as we're dropping them off, "Honey," he says to my mom, "Honey, was my book in the car? It was a dog-eared paperback $4.99 book. Was my book there? And when they got out, the cab driver turned to me and said, I mean, this is unbelievable. He said, your father said nothing about your stolen car, and he cares about this book? So a few days later, the police call my mother, and they say, we found your book, we found your car in a known drug location in Brooklyn. And she says, oh, you found the car. And my father hears this from the next room. He says, Deeb, was my book in the car? That is what we grew up with. And so to come here is to come home. Thank you so much for welcoming us. There's so much to talk about. We began our tour in Denver, Colorado, where we were celebrating Denver Open Media, public access. We were celebrating KGNU, community radio station there. We were celebrating Colorado Independent, an independent news website, and Free Speech TV, which is based there. And we're doing our event at Su Teatro Performing Arts Center. All the community were flying off to British Columbia. We went into the Unitarian Church in Denver, where Jeanette Vizquera was taking refuge. She's a Mexican immigrant who's been in the United States for over 20 years, paid her taxes every year, has 4 kids here. Her older daughter is DACA, is a dreamer. She's legally allowed to work and stay here. Why was Jeanette in the church? Why had she taken sanctuary there? Because she saw that in Washington State, Daniel Ramirez was arrested. He too was a dreamer. He too was DACA. How could he be arrested? If he was arrested, what hope did the 11 million undocumented immigrants have to stay in this country? Now, the new president, Donald Trump, has threatened to deport undocumented immigrants en masse, and she was really concerned. So in February, she went into the church. We immediately interviewed her. I was in the TV studio in New York. She was on Skype at the church. And then we came to see 2 months later what it was like still living there. It was a Saturday morning. Her kids were just waking up. And I met Zuri, who is 6, and Roberto, who's 10. They came in to sit with their mother as she was doing an interview. And Roberto, he was a wisp of a boy. 10 years old, he carried in a poster that his teacher had made. He goes to the Denver Public Schools, of his mother, their beautiful Mayan features. And it said at the bottom, keep families together. And he was going out with his little sister to be part of the Cesar Chavez March that day. And he said, as he stood next to his mother with his arm wrapped around her during the whole time I interviewed her, my mother cannot go outside because the ICE might arrest her. I am my mother's voice. We broadcast that interview a few days later on Democracy Now! And the next day, Time magazine announced its, 100 most important people in the world. And Jeanette Vizquera was one of them. So Time had a big gala in New York. All the glitterati were there. I don't know, John Legend was there among them. He had some choice words for the president. You might have seen that video gone viral. Of course, Jeanette couldn't come to the celebration of, well, people like her on the list. So the community had a Time gala in the church for her 2 Tuesday nights ago. So that was wonderful. Oh, by the way, she held a news conference when they announced she was one of the most important people. And she'd said to me, don't think for a minute. I mean, yes, I have sanctuary in this church, but I work from morning till night for other immigrants all over the country, that we don't stop. We don't just take refuge and sleep here and have other people work for us. So at the news conference, she holds up her 2016 tax returns, and she said, I make this available to all the press. Now I ask that the president does the same. And it was really cool, and it was a couple Tuesday nights ago, and we showed the pictures on Democracy Now! And ICE couldn't come into the church and get her. Oh, you know, she's had a lot of death threats against her. So I said, Jeanette, what gives you hope? And she said, because there's so many more people who express their support. And it made me think of Isabel Allende, the great writer who wrote House of the Spirits, who said, for every military thug, for every paramilitary out there, as she talked about Latin America, there are thousands of compañeros and compañeras that support people. And that's what gives hope. And that's very much what Jeanette said. And because of these death threats, well, the Denver police chief came to her and said, "We have your back. Don't worry. You call me if there's any problem." The Denver mayor said the same. The Denver congressman, Jared Polis, said exactly the same. I mean, we have discovered this everywhere. Juan Gonzalez, Juan, the great reporter that I worked with at Democracy Now! For 21 years, and I went to a meeting a couple weeks ago in New York City, downtown New York. It was a room about, the size, packed with people, not your typical noble activists who go out to protest, but city council members, state legislators, mayors from around the country, packed in to talk about how do they provide sanctuary in their communities. How do they protect the residents of their communities? There is a movement, a resistance that is every level of society. Never assume what a person thinks based on the position they occupy. I think this period of time is bringing out the best in America. It is uniting communities. Yes, I do think that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, through his actions, Muslim ban 1, Muslim ban 2, going after immigrants, the kind of bombing that has been done, the number of Navy SEALs who have actually died in various locations that's not very much stressed. I think he's uniting people across the political spectrum against him and for a more humane policy at home and abroad. And talking about humane policies, I just wanted to do a shout out to Jerry Berrigan, who's here, the Catholic worker movement that's here in this country. And the amazing work of Catholic workers throughout the United States. I went years ago to cover Catholic worker action at Joint Andrews Air Force Base. Nuns and priests were hammering on a warhead of a B-1 bomber and throwing their blood on it. I was arrested along with my colleague Jeremy Scahill. We were questioned by JAG and other levels of military police. But the level of activism is everywhere in this country. Catholic workers have been doing this for a very long time. It is expanding to every level of society. After the party on Tuesday night, on Wednesday morning, Arturo Hernandez Garcia was arrested in the streets of Denver. I knew Arturo because 2 years before, he'd taken refuge in the Unitarian Church, and we'd gone to interview him there. He was with his little daughter. He had 2 kids. And it's not clear, but it may well have been retaliation for this party the night before. Arturo, 2 years before, this was under the Obama administration, and make no mistake about it. I mean, Obama was called, even by his allies, the deporter-in-chief. He deported millions of immigrants, laid the foundation for what we're seeing now. More immigrants than any president in U.S. history. And Arturo took refuge then and only came out when he got a letter from the Department of Homeland Security that said he is not a priority for removal, for deportation. And he wanted to show good faith and to let others of the 11 million undocumented know in this country they don't necessarily have to live in the shadows. So he came out and he continued working with his brother-in-law in their tile business, paying taxes, being law-abiding residents of this country. And it wasn't until last Wednesday that he was picked up, and many feel it was retaliation for what Jeanette is doing in the church, and ICE can't get her. And so they retaliated against him. American Friends Service Committee called up ICE and said, "What are you doing? He has a letter that says he is not a priority." And Jennifer Piper, the young woman who called ICE to say this, said ICE responded, "This is a new day, this is a new administration, we don't have priorities anymore." A very odd way to put it. And then we were in Burlington, Vermont, speaking on this tour. And in the Unitarian Church where we were speaking, I saw Zuli Palacios and Kike Balcazar. They're two immigrants who are very active with Migrant Justice. It's an organization in Vermont. They had just come out of jail. They, too, had been picked up on the street and held for almost 2 weeks. Is the administration hunting down immigrants' rights activists? Every time one is arrested, it sends a chill through the communities of millions. You only have to arrest a few to destabilize whole communities. And this is what is a threat to national security. When people are afraid, when people must live in the shadows, they're not going to come out if someone has committed a crime and call the police and say, there is a murderer out there, I know who he is, there is a thief out there. They're not going to say, I'm an abused woman, could you help me? This is extremely serious. That is threatening to everyone. You want to increase the confidence people have in law enforcement in this country. But it is so significant that a number of police departments around the country, like the Sheriff of Austin, who is under siege by her governor, saying, we will not cooperate with ICE in this. This country is so much better than that. That we do hold the Statue of Liberty that's in our harbor in New York close to our hearts, the idea that we are there as a refuge for all. I am a Jewish American, and I certainly know about the Holocaust, as we all do. Well, everyone maybe except the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer.
Yeah.
Chemicals and chemical warfare against his own people. Never killed Jews, millions of Jews. Oh, those people who went to, what do you call them, Holocaust centers?
Yeah. Concentration centers.
I mean, we know about the voyage of the damned. The hundreds of Jewish refugees who tried to make it to U.S. soil and were turned back. Ultimately, many were killed. We cannot repeat this. And so you see a level of resistance we have not seen before. The day after the inauguration, I mean, a lot was made of President Trump's inaugural crowd size. I mean, he had a respectable number of people. It was 180,000 people. That's a heck of a lot of people. But he was disturbed that it was pointed out that President Obama's was larger than his, right? That 9 years before, he had 1.8 million people, what, 90% more than President Trump's. That took a little away from the attention to what happened just the next day on January 21st, when in Washington, 3 times the number of his inaugural crowd, mainly women, marched on the Capitol. It was just astounding to see. That wasn't one of the bigger protests. Los Angeles, there were 750,000 people. And it was like that. In Montpelier, Vermont, the capital, 20,000 people marched. They had to close off the interstate. Too many people were in the capital. In Park City, Utah, over 10,000 people. They had to close off all of the access roads to the main protest route because they said they couldn't handle all the people. We have never seen anything like this. And then the Muslim bans, first one, barring refugees from 7 Muslim-majority countries from coming into this country. I mean, the spontaneous uprising that happened at airports all over this country, the thousands of people that went to JFK, that went to Dulles, a senator and a judge were roughed up at Dulles when they were trying to speak out. At LAX, President Trump asks who's paying them. I saw a sign the other day at either the People's Climate March we broadcast for 5 hours. Anytime you want to see these movements, check out if democracynow.org is there doing a 5-hour broadcast. We did it on Earth Day, April 22nd, from the March for Science. We did it the next week, April 29th, the People's Climate March. Someone came up to me and said, I'm a professional protester. I'm just doing this pro bono right now. You know, when he announced for president, he had paid actors there to applaud for him at Trump Tower. So he projects, and that's how he thinks, why would anyone go out if they weren't being paid? That is what is so important right now, the testament to people's spirit and the American soul. and how this violated what so many people felt, these Muslim bans. And then you had the Washington judge who said no, he stayed the ban. And President Trump replied, this so-called judge. I mean, we're engaging in a nationwide civics lesson right now. And kindergartners, high schoolers, and I hope President Trump too will learn about the co-equal branches of government, legislative, judiciary, executive, and that's what ensures a democracy. He talked about the so-called judge in the first Muslim ban, and then they tried again with Muslim ban 2. 6 majority Muslim countries, they would prevent refugees from coming in both cases, Syria included. And so when President Trump bombed Syria, the Syrian air base, remember, he's bombing Syria before and after this, and many civilians are being killed. This is the first time they did the military air base. 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles made by Raytheon. Last documents we have is that Trump has investments in Raytheon. Well, it's so important. So did he make money on this bombing? But this is very important. If we don't know what his investments are, how are we going to determine whether foreign policy is being conducted to enrich him or because we're trying to ensure the security of this country? That's why it's so important that, among other things, his tax returns are released, why presidents have done this for decades, and why it's absolutely critical, why thousands of people came out on tax day demanding this. And Republicans and Democrats and independents are talking about this, are demanding this. But on the issue of the judges, he says no to Syrian refugees. He said that the gassing of the children horrified him, and those images were horrific and must be investigated. But he won't allow any of them into this country. He doesn't want them to come into the United States. And so many Syrians said that you must let us come in, like the voyage of the damned. We've got to get international aid to people there, and we have to let people who are fleeing destruction into this country. So, you have the first so-called judge, and then the second ban was stayed by a Hawaiian judge, and it was astounding that last week you had the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, say how, on a right-wing radio talk show, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can say, no, stop the actions of the President of the United States. It's that civic lesson he has to take. How is it possible that a judge can check the executive? Well, that is the beauty of our government. I think the only people that maybe took sustenance from this, who were encouraged, is the sovereignty movement in Hawaii. They don't want to be part of the United States, and they probably... Before, you can send them to stories@democracynow.org. You can give us names of people to interview, stories in the community that you think need to be covered, and we very much appreciate links to articles and statements that people have made, etc. That's how Democracy Now! Is a daily grassroots global news hour. But I really do think it's all of these places that are mainstream media. I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, racial, economic, social justice, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. It's also something Noam Chomsky talks about a great deal, and talks about the electricity in a community that has community media. He says he knows when he goes into a community to speak if there is some, I call it underground railroad of information. And so we're offering this DVD of Noam that Juan and I had a chance to have a conversation with him just a few weeks ago in our studios, and we'd love to make it available to you. Now, speaking of Juan, he was just inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, the first Latino journalist to be inducted, and we all went to the ceremony. And how he was inducted with Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl and Max Frankel at times, but his speech put them all to shame. He said, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. He said, I tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. He said, I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. Those are the words of Juan Gonzalez. He retired from the New York Daily News last year after 29 years as a columnist. There were so many retirement parties for him. I mean, down at the Francis Tavern, this historic place in downtown Manhattan, I was on the book tour then of the hardcover of Democracy Now! And I kept getting these texts. De Blasio just came in, the mayor of New York. Oh, and Governor Cuomo just left. And there's pictures of all of them. You see that Cuomo and de Blasio won't be in the same place because they hate each other. But and I'm going, and no, Senator Schumer just came in. These are to the parties, for one. And I'm saying, what do you do? All these political leaders are feting you. We're supposed to be separate from, not a party to the parties, but I decided that the reason they're all coming is they want to see with their own eyes that this guy that dogged them for so long is actually leaving. See, we have a job which is not necessarily one that makes us popular. But there's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the Constitution. We're supposed to be the check and balance on power. No, we are not the enemy of the American people, as Donald Trump has dubbed the press, the enemy of the people. The media is what will save us. Why? Because it provides a forum for people to speak for themselves. This is absolutely critical. You know many people, you speak to them, you learn in your community, but how you learn about the rest of the world if someone isn't from another place is through the media, and it has to be through something other than a corporate lens. David and I wrote a book together called Static, and the reason we called it that is even in this high-tech digital age with digital radio and high-definition television, all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need the media to give us is a dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Which is why I want to end today on the Dakota Access Pipeline, talking about a movement that makes history. Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota opened up her property to the resistance, saying we must do this together. Her beautiful property along the Cannonball River. The resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline being built by Energy Transfer Partners. What the Native Americans call the Black Snake. It would take the fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, through South Dakota, through Iowa, Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans said no, not near our land, not under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that provides water to 17 million people downstream. They don't call themselves protesters, they call themselves water protectors. It is such a critical story, this epic struggle. So many people came to Sacred Stone Resistance Camp. They opened up another and another, and the Red Warrior Camp and others, and thousands soon came. Largest gathering of Native Americans from South America, the United States, Central America, and Canada, First Nations, and then their allies. It was astounding as it grew through the election year. We went to North Dakota on Labor Day weekend. I mean, that was late. We were covering it before, but we weren't on the ground till then. A judge that week was gathering information to make a decision the next week. And he asked the tribe, if you say it's going through your sacred burial ground, prove it. Give me a map. And they did. And they handed him the map where their sacred burial mounds were, and he gave it to Energy Transfer Partners. And that weekend, we were covering all the ceremonies of people in this area of North Dakota. Now, it is amazing to cover the protests there. You have hundreds of people that march up, led by the elders, women, men, and the grandchildren. They will often hold glasses of water. And they are met by a massive militarized force, the Sheriff's Department of North Dakota. It is just astounding. You know it from Ferguson. You saw it, right, those images. It is unbelievable. I mean, in North Dakota, these back prairie roads, they have MRAPs, they have tanks. How is this possible? Well, this is recycling in America today. They take the military hardware from places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and they bring it back here and give it to the police departments of this country. It is such a tragic error. Take it from Norm Stamper, the former police chief of Seattle, who presided over the police actions at the Battle of Seattle protesting the World Trade Organization in 1999, when thousands of people, high schoolers, teachers, doctors, nurses, farmers from around the world gathered to protest this supranational organization that could overturn the laws of democratically elected legislatures, and they were saying no in the largest export city in the United States, Seattle. And they were met by massive amounts of tear gas. Stamper had to go to other states to get more gas to attack the people, and rubber bullets, and much more. They arrested hundreds of people. This is back in '99. He was ousted, as he should have been. We just had him in our studio a few weeks ago. Norm Stamper says it was the worst mistake of his life. He said, when we are militarized to this level, of course we see the people in the streets, not as our kids and our teachers and our doctors and our nurses, we see them as the enemy. He said, I made a tragic error. And now he speaks around the country for police reform. But this we see on steroids now. This is almost 2 decades later. And so these militarized sheriff's departments, like we see in North Dakota, they hit the people with gas, with rubber bullets. It is terrifying. And still, they hold out the water protectors, and they say, we're doing this to protect the water for your children as well as ours. And so we were covering all of this, and on Saturday of Labor Day weekend, we followed a group of Native Americans who were going to perform a ceremony around the sacred burial grounds, and they saw the Dakota Access Pipeline bulldozers operating at full tilt over their burial grounds. They were shocked. They didn't even think they were going to be working on a holiday weekend. And there they were. They believed that when the judge gave the map to Dakota Access Pipeline, they leapfrogged over from where they were to the burial grounds to destroy them, so that even however the judge ruled the next week, they would have changed the facts on the ground. It would be a moot point. Children, men, boys, girls, and they came up on the burial grounds and they told the bulldozers, they demanded they stop. It was amazing, incredibly brave, because these massive machines are very dangerous as they are excavating the earth. I can only think back, as we're filming that day, to March 16, 2003, 3 days before the U.S. invaded Iraq and another place in the Middle East, in Rafah, in Gaza, when an evergreen college student from Washington named Rachel Corrie stood in front of a bulldozer. This was an Israeli military bulldozer in Gaza to protect the family of a Palestinian pharmacist, because the bulldozer was going to bulldoze the house. And she and other international solidarity movement activists stood there with their orange fluorescent vests like construction workers to say no. And she was crushed by the bulldozer. She was killed. And that's what I thought about when I saw these women and children standing in front of these active bulldozers, but this time they won. And the bulldozers pulled back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bulldozers pulling back. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards released dogs on the protesters, on the water protectors. Dogs, attacked dogs, and they attacked the women and children, the boys, the girls. We were showing the people with bloody arms. We showed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Ultimately, they were forced back that day, the bulldozers and the guards. But the people were injured, they were wounded. We posted that video on Facebook that night. Within a day, 14 million views on Facebook. The corporate media, this is election year. Not one, I don't call them journalists, media personality in the general election running one of the debates asked one of these candidates about climate change. Not one, even in the face of this epic historic struggle, not to mention just the issue of climate change alone. And this showed, when the media says people don't care about that, quite the opposite. People are hungry for this information. And so we went back to New York, and the judge was ruling on Friday. On Thursday, North Dakota Governor Dalrymple called out the National Guard. It did not look good for the tribe. And also quietly, I didn't know this at the time, on Thursday they issued an arrest warrant for me. Friday, the judge rules. It's 5 o'clock. Oh, Obama was in Asia that week. He made a historic trip to Laos. And there he had a democracy forum. And he invited students from around Asia to come. And the last person to ask a question was a young Malaysian student. And she said, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline, President Obama? No American journalist had asked him about this publicly. And here she was. And she would come to learn about democracy from him. He held forth eloquently about the oppression of Native Americans in this country. And as for the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, he said, I have to check with my team. He did come back to the United States that week, and reportedly he saw the video of the dogs. It wasn't lost on the first African-American president. As Winona LaDuke said, the great indigenous leader from White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, we interviewed her the day of the dogs. She said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not 1965. This is not Alabama. We are through. On Friday at 5 o'clock, the judge ruled against the tribe. The Obama Justice Department had prevailed. 15 minutes later, the Obama Justice Department, Interior Department, and Army Corps of Engineers issued an unprecedented 3-agency letter saying we're not moving forward at this moment. So justice trumped justice. Clearly this was coordinated from the White House, and they had a pretty good sense that the judge was going to rule against the tribe. This was a very big deal. The tribe was suffering from whiplash. First, the worst decision of their life, and second, the best decision. They're going to wait. So we had gone to Canada. We weren't fleeing. We had gone to Canada that day because I was invited to the Toronto International Film Festival. They were premiering the film on I.F. Stone, the muckraking journalist, who said to young people, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3, all governments lie. That's the name of the documentary. You should see it. And it also profiled Democracy Now!, also Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone and other independent news organizations, so we all went up to speak. When we were at the University of Toronto speaking to a group like this at the university, and in the middle of my talk I see it says, you're under arrest. I said, well, it says something like there's an arrest warrant for you. I have no idea if this is a scam. I don't know what's going on, but I do see it's a North Dakota number. It was a North Dakota lawyer. So I have to get to the airport, I realize, as I'm speaking, because if this arrest warrant goes into the system, you don't get arrested automatically with an arrest warrant, but if you have to deal with police, FBI, or border guards, that's when you'll get picked up. And I have to go over the border. Like, I gotta come home. Can they really just not let me back into the United States? I don't know. I don't want to say I'm going. I didn't want to say this was happening, so I just said, could someone call me a cab? Went back. I was able to get back into the United States, came back to New York. I didn't take the arrest warrant personally, but because I knew it was a message to all journalists, do not come to North Dakota, which is why we need to be there. And I didn't want young journalists to feel that they couldn't afford to go to North Dakota, because you can't cover this issue and also get put in jail. I mean, they don't have the resources to deal with this. We shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. And so we went back to North Dakota a few weeks later to call their bluff, to challenge the charges, and as we landed in Bismarck, North Dakota, the prosecutor announced he was dropping the charges. But he announced he would bring new charges against me, riot, for which I would face a year in jail, and that I would be arraigned 3 days later on Monday. I was shocked that they would continue this level of harassment, but it did give us 3 days to cover the continued protests. And then we did the show in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail, where I would have to turn myself in. The courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. That was our backdrop. And I interviewed the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dave Archibald, who had been arrested himself for civil disobedience. Low level, misdemeanor, but he was strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit. He's the chairman of the tribe. I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. She was one of the first to be arrested that summer because she cared about the health of the children. She was strip searched, she was put in an orange jumpsuit, and she was jailed. How much humiliation can people take? At the end of the show, the arraignment would be at 1:30. Hundreds of Native Americans came to show their support, and just before the arraignment, the judge, who would be signing off on the charges, announced that they would not bring the charges against me because there was so much international media attention. I mean, it was the BBC homepage, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, even Vogue magazine. I have to spiff up my ass. And they couldn't take the pressure. Think what happens when the media spotlight shines in the right direction. Native Americans who are going to court that day for felony or misdemeanor charges, they too, a number of them had their charges dropped. This is what reality TV that actually shows reality on the ground can do. It is so important that we support independent media. That was October. December, the Obama administration once again ruled they would not grant the permit to allow Dakota Access Pipeline to go under the Missouri River. This was a huge victory for the tribe. And then Donald Trump became president. And one of his first executive orders was to say, we're going to go ahead with the Keystone XL and with the Dakota Access Pipeline. But at the People's Climate March, many Native Americans were there, and they said no oil has yet flowed through that pipeline. And they've launched an international divestment campaign against Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and other financial institutions. It's beyond DAPL. They are saying they're fighting for a sustainable country, a country that relies on renewables and not a fossil fuel economy, that they are talking about the fate of the planet, and this is a message to everyone, and it is an ongoing struggle. Many of the people at the Climate March and the Science March wore buttons that said, science, not silence, because the administration now is filled with climate change deniers. From Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, now the head of the State Department, Secretary of State, to Scott Pruitt, Oklahoma Attorney General, now head of the EPA, which he sued 14 times. And people were saying, let's respect the facts. We cannot be silent. And so I go back to Hans and Sophie Scholl, a brother and sister in World War II in Germany. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? So they put out 6 pamphlets. And they published them with their professor and other students and workers. And on one of those pamphlets it said, we will not be silent. They said they did this to ensure that at least the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they got them out everywhere under cover of darkness, in alleyways, in schoolyards, in marketplaces. And then Hans and Sophie and their professor were caught. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic Oath of us all today, should be the Hippocratic Oath of the media, as well as everyone. We shall not be silent. Democracy now.